Lecture 19, The New Economy, Industrialization, Transportation, and Commercialization, 1800 to 1850. Introduction. With the addition of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the American Republic, barely more than a quarter century old, stretched across half a continent. Though enormous in size, the country's economy remained terribly backward when compared to much of Europe. Over the next half-century, however, three major developments would transform the American economy and society in ways that Americans at the beginning of the 19th century could scarcely have imagined. These were the emergence of the national transportation system, the beginnings of industrialization, and the creation of a new commercialized economy that integrated the economies of every major nation in the country into one large national system. As indicated above, these changes impacted every part of the country. Their impact was felt more strongly, however, in the North than in the South, which meant that by the midpoint of the century, the northern and southern economies had diverged sharply to the point that the North had a significant advantage in population, industry, and transportation infrastructure. The Transportation Revolution. In 1800, the nation's road system was still incredibly primitive, so that travel was very difficult in most circumstances. Most roads were dirt, so that in the spring they turned to mud, while in the winter snow often made them impassable. Now, as seen in a previous lecture, our lecture on the Age of Nationalism, the federal government began making sort of haphazard strides towards building a national road system, including the so-called National Road, also known as the Cumberland Road, built from Cumberland, Maryland to Vandalia, Illinois, between 1811 and 1839. Additionally, the federal government, along with the state and local governments, built many turnpikes, i.e. toll roads, where travelers paid a toll to defray the cost of the building of the road in various locations, so that by 1820 the nation had roughly 4,000 miles of toll roads. Rather than dirt, these roads were usually paved with sand or gravel, and usually they had bridges at major water crossings like rivers or large streams. So travel on these roads, while still hard and slow, was much better than it had been beforehand. Now, as helpful as the new roads were, they were still far short of providing for the growing nation's transportation needs. Fortunately, the period from about 1820 to 1840 witnessed a tremendous surge in construction of another form of transportation infrastructure, and that would be canals. Now, canals are man-made waterways, typically connecting two pre-existing bodies of water, a lake or a river or a bay or something of that nature. Because they are man-made waterways and typically follow a very level gradient, they have slow-moving currents, allowing for shallow draft canal barges to move up and down the canal, powered either by the crew pushing the boat with poles or by horses pulling the boat from the shoreline with ropes. In effect, these canals became water highways, allowing for transportation costs for passengers and goods to fall dramatically, thereby facilitating commerce. The first major canal project was New York's famed Erie Canal, pictured here. Built from 1819 to 1825, it eventually stretched 364 miles from Lake Erie to the Hudson River. All along the canal route, trade flourished, and major cities, including Utica, Buffalo, and Rochester, rapidly sprung up. The success of the Erie Canal set off a major canal building craze, particularly in the northern states of Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. By 1840, more than $200 million had been invested in canal construction, resulting in more than 300 miles of canals. Significantly, only one major canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio Central, running um, through Virginia and Maryland, was built in the South. Along with the canal building craze came the first steamboats. The first commercial steamboat, by the way, here's a picture I meant to show you. A picture of one of those canal barges being pulled along by a team of donkeys in this case, although they also use oxen. Pardon me, let me go back. So along with the canal building craze came the first steamboats. The very first commercial steamboat voyage was the Clermont, a steamboat ship, a steam-powered ship built by engineer Robert Fulton, which began making trips along the Hudson River between Albany and New York City in 1807. As with the Erie Canal, success spawned many imitators, so that by 1820 there were 67 steamboats operating on America's rivers, 127 by 1830, and 536 by 1850. The major advantage of steamboats was that of their speed. They averaged roughly 100 miles per day compared to only 20 miles per day for other river craft. Compared to roads, canals, and steamboats, railroads arrived in America fairly late. The first railroad built in the United States didn't come along until 1828. But from the 1830s through the 1850s, the nation witnessed an enormous railroad building frenzy that saw the construction of more than 31,000 miles of railroads between 1830 and 1860. What was driving the railroad building binge were two very important factors. First, unlike water transportation, which relied upon existing rivers or very expensive man-made canals, railroads could be built almost anywhere. It simply involved clearing a path, laying a track along the ground, and then you have it. They're also more direct. Canals, of course, have to follow level ground. They can't go up over mountains. And, of course, river transportation or coastal transportation, you also have to follow the geography of the land. But railroads could be built anywhere. You could have a railroad running more or less a straight line from point A to point B. If it goes over a gulch or a gorge, you build a bridge, and so on. So they're much more direct. The second advantage, or the second factor behind the railroad building binge, was that railroads were also faster than any other form of transportation out there. They averaged, get this, 15 to 20 miles per hour. Now, I know that that's probably about as fast as most of you drive in a parking lot today, but at the time, especially when you consider that railroad cars would travel all day and all night with relatively few stops along the way, this was by far the best transportation deal you could get. It was provided the best bang for your buck, so to speak. The best you might get from a steamship was about 100 miles per day. But by railroad, you could travel 100 miles in 5 to 8 hours. Now, as with canals, the burst in railroad construction benefited the North more than the South, though the South did have some railroads built during this time as well. Point 3, the beginning of industrialization. Now, for the purposes of this lecture, what we're going to call industrialization will be defined as the process by which a variety sorry, let me start over. For the purposes of this lecture, industrialization will be defined as the process by which a society transforms itself from a predominantly agricultural society to one based on the production of manufactured goods and services, usually involving the replacement of manual labor by some kind of mechanized mass production techniques. Now, by this definition, the first Western European country to undergo the transition to an industrialized economy was Great Britain, where industrial techniques had been used to create the country's enormous textile industry in the late 18th century. By that point, the British textile industry was so hugely profitable that some American entrepreneurs sought to copy their methods and machinery. The British tried to maintain their industrial edge, particularly in the making of cloth, by making it illegal to take textile machinery out of the country, or for skilled industrial workers to emigrate to other countries for fear that their knowledge might be passed on to someone else. Their restrictions, however, were all for naught, because eventually American businessmen and investors found ways around them. For example, in 1789, an English textile apprentice named Samuel Slater memorized the plans to the most up-to-date textile machinery and then snuck out of the country and boarded a ship for America, where he sold the designs to businessmen in Providence, Rhode Island, who built what became known as the Slater Mill, the most advanced cotton mill in America at that time. Now, not content simply to copy British technology, however, some American entrepreneurs tried to find ways to improve upon it. For example, in 1814, Francis Cabot Lowell and his partner Paul Moody opened up their first cotton mill in Waltham, Massachusetts. It featured new and improved textile machinery that Lowell had designed himself after touring British textile factories in 1810. One of the innovations that Lowell introduced to textile manufacturing was a power loom that greatly cut down the time and expense of converting cotton into cloth. In 1823, Lowell and his business partners, called the Boston Associates, moved their operations to an entirely new town, Lowell, Massachusetts, constructed by them and the junction of the Hartford and Merrimack rivers. By 1826, the town had 2,500 inhabitants, and by 1836 their number had increased to 17,000 total. One thing that set the Lowell mills apart, even from other American textile manufacturers, was their predominantly female workforce. In the early years of Lowell, women had comprised approximately 75% of the company's workforce. The owners did this to cut costs. Women could, after all, be paid less than men. But they also portrayed their mill as a step up for young farm girls from the surrounding countryside to work for a while, learn a trade, and maybe earn enough money to pay for a dowry so as to go get a husband. Textiles were not the only segment of the economy to undergo industrialization in the early 19th century. Another area was the manufacture of machinery, including firearms, which underwent a technological revolution in the early 1800s. Key to this revolution was the concept of interchangeable parts. Contrary to the legend that describes the idea of interchangeable parts to Eli Whitney, the basic concept of mechanical interchangeability came from Europe. The Swedes, for example, were making clocks using interchangeable gears by the early 1700s. Whitney did, however, become one of the first gun manufacturers to apply the concept of interchangeability to the manufacture of firearms. By the way, here is a picture of Eli Whitney, for those of you who wanted to know what he looked like. And here is a diagram of the interchangeable parts used in a Whitney musket. As I said, he applied the concept of interchangeability to the manufacture of firearms in the early 1800s. Well, what caused him to do this? Well, in 1798, he received a contract from the federal government to supply roughly 10,000 muskets to the U.S. Army. What Whitney did was to use special molds and machinery to make each part of the musket exactly alike. This did three things. One, it made sure that every musket would work exactly the same way. Two, it also ensured that if a musket broke, it could be easily fixed by simply dropping or stripping down the weapon and swapping out the broken part with a new one. Three, it greatly cut down on the time and cost of making a musket by making assembly relatively cheap and painless. Although first applied in weapons making, the concept of interchangeable parts quickly spread to other areas of manufactures, including clocks, watches, carriages, sewing machines, and cotton gins. As seen above, this idea did not originate in the United States, but it was so thoroughly and so frequently applied there that other nations, including the British, began referring to it as the American system of manufacturing. And so the name has stuck.